Reading. I have two little things about the reading. The first one is, if you're recording, I would ask that you not post this portion until the tour is done, and I'm back from the UK. You can post the rest of it, and then when the tour is done, you can post this part. I just want the readings to be something kind of special for people who come to my signings. The other thing is, this reading is a touch on the violent side. It's kind of right up to the edge of the violence that I like to include, so I want to give a warning on that. It's no more so than some of the parts of my other books, but it is something that I want to make people aware of who brought their children or something like that. We are going to be reading from the Stormlight Archive, Book 3. I am going to be reading from Dalinar's flashback sequences, which is nice to read because it is not a spoiler for the Stormlight Archive if you haven't read it yet, because it takes place 30-something years before the first book starts. Let me see if I can find that. And as I warned you, this one's just a touch longer than most of the readings. I try to keep them at like 15 minutes. This one's just a tad longer. I'm going to get this ready. Rockbuds crunched like skulls beneath Dalinar's boots as he charged across the burning field. His elites tromped behind him, a hand-picked force of soldiers, both wide-eyed and dark. They weren't an honor guard. Dalinar didn't need guards. These were simply the men he considered competent enough not to embarrass him. Around him, Rockbud smoldered. Moss, dried from the summer heat and long days between storms this time of year, flared up in waves, setting the Rockbud shells themselves aflame. Dalinar charged through the smoke, trusting in his padded armor and thick boots to protect him. Flamespren, like tiny people made of fire, danced from one patch of flame to the next. The enemy, pressed by his armies from the north, had pulled back into this town just ahead. Dalinar had held himself back with difficulty from entering that initial clash. He'd known the real fighting would take place here, in the city. He hadn't expected the enemy to, in a desperate move, fire this plain, burning their own crops to block the southern approach. Well, no matter. The fires could go to damnation for all Dalinar cared. He led his men in a charge, and though some were overwhelmed by this smoke or heat, most stayed with him. They'd crash into the enemy from the south, pressing them between his main army and these men. Hammer and anvil, the best kind of tactic, the type that didn't allow his enemies to get away from him. As Dalinar burst from the smoky air, he found a few lines of spearmen hastily making ranks on the southern edge of the town. There were remnants of a wall, but the enemy he fought had torn that down themselves a few years back when conquering here. Dalinar had forgotten the town name, but the location was ideal. A large ridge to the east made a natural break from the storms and had allowed this place to sprawl almost like a real city. Dalinar screamed at the enemy soldiers, beating his sword, just a regular longsword, against his shield. He wore a sturdy breastplate and helm along with iron-lined boots. The spearmen ahead of him wavered as his elites roared from the smoke and flame, shouting a bloodthirsty cacophony. A few of the spearmen dropped weapons and ran. Fiercepren, globs of violet goo, wriggled up in mass around the enemy rank, and Dalinar grinned. He didn't need shards to intimidate. He hit the swordsman like a boulder rolling through a grove of saplings, swinging his sword and sending limbs into the air. A good fight was about momentum. Don't stop. Don't think. Drive forward and convince your enemies that they were as good as dead already. That way, they'd fight you less as you sent them to their pyres. As he waited among them, the spearmen thrust spears frantically, less to try to kill him and more to try to push away this madman. Their ranks collapsed, and many of the men turned their sides to Dalinar's own force, focused only on him. Dalinar laughed, slamming aside a pair of swords with his shield, then disemboweling one man with a sword deep in the gut. The man's allies backed away at the horrific sight, so Dalinar came in swinging, catching the two off balance, killing them with a sword that bore their friend's blood. Dalinar's elites decimated the now broken line, and the real slaughter began. Dalinar pushed forward, keeping momentum, shearing through the ranks until he reached the back, breathing deeply and wiping ashen sweat from his face. A young spearman fell before him, crying, screaming for his mother as he crawled across the stony ground, trailing blood. Fear-spren mixed with pain-spren all around. Dalinar shook his head, picking up a fallen spear and striding past the youth, slamming it down into his heart as he passed. The man often cried for parents as they died. Didn't matter how old they were. He'd seen graybeards do it, same as kids like this one. He's not much younger than I am, Dalinar thought. Maybe 17. But then Dalinar had never felt young, regardless of his age. His elites filled in behind him, having carved the enemy line in two. Dalinar danced, shaking off his bloodied blade, feeling alert, excited, but not yet alive. Where was it? Come on. A larger group of soldiers hiked down the street toward him, led by a small group of officers in white and red. Dalinar could see from the way they pulled up, alarmed, that they hadn't expected their spearmen to fall so quickly. Dalinar charged. His elites knew to watch, so he was followed by a force of 50 or 60. The rest had to finish off the unfortunate spearmen ranks. Well, 50 would do. The crowded confines of the town would mean Dalinar shouldn't need much more. As he neared this newer force, he focused his attention on the one man riding a horse. The fellow wore plate armor, obviously meant to recreate shard plate, though it was only of common steel. It lacked the beauty, the power of true plate. He still looked like he was the most important person around. Hopefully that would mean he was the best. The man's honor guard rushed to engage, and Dalinar felt something stir inside of him, like a thirst, a physical need. Challenge. He wanted to challenge Stormlight. He engaged the first member of the guard, attacking with swift brutality. Fighting on the battlefield wasn't like in the dueling arena. Dalinar didn't dance around the fellow, testing his abilities. Out here, that sort of thing got you stabbed in the back by somebody else. Instead, Dalinar slammed his sword down against the enemy, who raised his shield to block. Dalinar hit a series of quick, powerful blows like a drummer pounding out a furious beat. Bam, 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 bam! The enemy soldier didn't have an opportunity to mount a counterattack. He clutched his shield over his head, putting Dalinar squarely in control. Dalinar kept hitting as he raised his own shield before him and shoved it against the man, forcing him backward until he stumbled. The stumble caused the shield to shift, letting Dalinar's sword come down at an angle and bite the arm. The shield dropped completely, and this man didn't get a chance to scream for his mother. Dalinar let his elites handle the others. The way was open to the Bright Lord. Not old enough to be the High Prince. Some other important light eyes? Did Dalinar remember something about a son during Gavilar's endless planning meetings? Well, this man certainly looked grand on that white mare, watching the battle behind a helmed face, cape streaming out behind him. Dalinar pulled up, swiping his sword eagerly, breathing in and out. The foe raised his own sword to his helm in a sign of challenge accepted. Idiot. Dalinar gestured, counting on at least one of his strikers to have lived and stayed with him. Indeed, Jenin stepped up, unhooked the short bow from his back, and, as the Bright Lord shouted his surprise, shot the horse in the chest. Hate shooting horses, Jenin grumbled as the beast reared in pain. Like throwing 1,000 bromes into the storming ocean, Bright Lord. I'll buy you 2 when we're finished with this, Dalinar said as the Lord fell backward, tumbling off his horse. Dalinar dodged around flashing hooves and snorts of pain, seeking out the fallen man. He was pleased to find the enemy rising. Dalinar came in swinging. The Bright Lord managed to get his sword up, and Dalinar battered it away, then dropped his own shield, and came in with a 2-handed power swing, intending to knock the light-eyed soldier back down. Fortunately, the man was good enough to recover his stance and intercept the blow with his shield. They probably heard the subsequent crack all the way back in Kholinar. Indeed, it vibrated up Dalinar's arms. Momentum. Life was about momentum. Pick a direction and don't let anything, man or storm, turn you aside. Dalinar battered at the Bright Lord, driving him backward until the man pulled a surprised feint and managed to get in close to ram Dalinar with his shield. Dalinar ducked the blow that followed, but the backhand hit him solidly on the side of the head, sending him stumbling. His helm twisted, metal bent by the blow and biting into his scalp, drawing blood. He saw double, his vision swimming. He roared as the Bright Lord smartly came in for the kill. Dalinar swung his blade up in a lurching, full-shoulder blow, slapping the Lord's own weapon out of his hands. The man punched Dalinar in the face with a gauntlet, and his nose crunched. Dalinar fell to his knees, vision blurry. His foe was breathing deeply, cursing between breaths, winded by the short but frantic contest. The Bright Lord fished at his belt for a knife. An emotion stirred inside of Dalinar, a fire that filled the pit inside. It washed through him and awakened him, bringing clarity. The sounds of his elites fighting the Lord's honor guard faded, metal on metal becoming clinks, grunts becoming like a distant humming. Dalinar grinned. Then the grin became a toothy smile. His vision returned as the Bright Lord, who had just retrieved his knife, looked up and started, stumbling back. He seemed horrified. Dalinar roared, spitting blood and throwing himself at the enemy. The swing that came for him seemed pitiful, and Dalinar ducked it, pushing his shoulder against his foe and shoving him backward. Something thrummed inside of Dalinar, the pulse of the battle, the rhythm of killing and dying, the thrill. He knocked his opponent off balance, then reached for his sword. Dim, however, hollered his name and tossed him a poleaxe, with a hook on one side and a broad, thin axe on the other. Dalinar seized it from the air and spun, ducking the Lord's swing. At the same time, he hooked the man around the ankle with the axe and yanked. The Bright Lord fell in a clatter of steel. Before Dalinar could attack further, unfortunately, the honor guard became a bother. Two had managed to extricate themselves from Dalinar's men and came to the defense of their Bright Lord. Dalinar caught their sword strikes on his polearm and twisted it about, backing away and bringing the axe head slamming to one man's side. He ripped it free and spun again, this time slamming the weapon down into the rising lord's head and sending him to his knees. Then he came back around and caught the other guard's sword on the haft of the polearm. Dalinar pushed upward, holding the polearm in two hands, sweeping the guard's blade up into the air over his head and stepping forward until he's face to face with the fellow. Dalinar spit blood from his shattered nose into the guard's face and then kicked him in the stomach. He turned toward the Lord, who had scrambled once again to his feet and was now trying to flee. Dalinar growled and swung the polearm by one hand, hooking the spike into the Lord's side and yanking, dropping him a third time. The Bright Lord rolled, and he was greeted by the sight of Dalinar slamming his polearm down with two hands, driving the spike right through the breastplate and into his chest. It made a satisfying crunch, and Dalinar pulled it out bloodied. The blow seemed a signal of sorts, and the honor guard and other soldiers finally broke before his elites. Dalinar grinned as he watched them go, glory spread popping up around him like glowing golden orbs. His men took out their short bows and dropped a good dozen of the fleeing enemy in the backs. Damnation, it felt good to best a force larger than his own. The thrill dwindled. He could never seem to hold on to it as long as he wanted. Nearby, the man he'd felled croaked softly. Dalinar stepped over, curious, kicking at the armored chest. "Why?" the man said from within his helm. "Why us?" "Don't know," Dalinar said, tossing the polearm back to Dim. You don't know?" "My brother chooses," Dalinar said. "I just go where he points me." He gestured toward the dying man, and Dim rammed a sword into the hole in the breastplate, finishing the job. The fellow had fought reasonably well, no need to extend his suffering. Another soldier approached, handing Dalinar his sword. It had a chip in it the size of a thumb, right on the blade. Looked like it had bent as well. "You're supposed to stick it in the squishy parts, Bright Lord," Dim said, "not pound it against the hard parts." "I'll keep that in mind," Dalinar said, tossing the sword aside as one of his men selected a replacement from among the fallen men of high enough rank. "You all right, Bright Lord?" Dim asked. "Never been better," Dalinar said, then sucked blood up through his broken nose. Hurt like damnation itself. His men formed up around him, officers nearby, and Dalinar led the way further down the street. Before too long, he could make out the bulk of the enemy still fighting up ahead, harrowed by the main force of his army. He halted his men, contemplative. "Orders, sir?" Thaka, captain of the elites, asked. "Raid those buildings," Dalinar said, pointing at a line of homes. "Let's see how well they fight while they see us rounding up their families. The men will want to loot." "What is there to loot in a hovel like this? Soggy hog's-hide and old rockbud bowls?" He pulled off his helm and wiped the blood from his face. "They can loot afterward. Right now I need hostages. And there are civilians somewhere in this storming town. Find them." Thaka nodded, shouting the orders. Dalinar reached for some water. He'd need to meet up with Sadeas, and something slammed into Dalinar's shoulder. He caught only a brief sight of it, a black blur that hit with the force of a roundhouse kick. It threw him down, and pain flared up from his side. "An arrow?" he said, blinking as he found himself lying on the ground. A storming arrow sprouted from his right shoulder, with a long, thick shaft. It had gone right through the armor. "My lord!" Thaka said, kneeling, shielding Dalinar with his body. Clack, my lord, are you... Who in damnation shot that? Dalinar demanded. Up there, one of his men said, pointing at the ridge above town. That's got to be over 300 yards, Dalinar said, shoving Thaka aside and standing. That can't. He was watching, so he was able to jump out of the way of the next arrow, which dropped a mere foot from him, slamming into the stone ground. Dalinar stared at it, then started shouting, Horses! Where are my storming horses? Had the fires delayed them? No, fortunately. A small group of soldiers had guided them more carefully across the fields, but had caught up by now. They stood with the rear guard of the elites and came trotting forward as Dalinar's orders were passed, bringing all 11 horses. Dalinar had to dodge another arrow as he seized the reins of Full Knight, his black gelding, and heaved himself into the saddle. He galloped back the way he'd come in, trailed by 10 of his best men. There had to be a way up that slope. There, a rocky set of switchbacks, shallow enough that he didn't mind running Full Knight up them. No more dangerous than charging into battle had been for Dalinar himself. The horse slipped a few times, but nothing drastic. Dalinar was more worried that by the time he reached the top, his quarry would have escaped. He burst onto the top of the ridge, and an arrow slammed into his right shoulder, going straight through the breastplate and nearly throwing him from the saddle. Damnation! He hung on somehow, clenching the reins in one hand and leaning low, watching ahead as the archer, still a distant figure, stood on a rocky knob and launched another arrow, and another. Storms, that fellow was quick. Dalinar jerked Full Knight to one side, then the other, feeling the thrumming sense of the thrill return. Hooves made a clatter on stone as another arrow zipped past his face, dangerously close. Ahead, the archer seemed to grow alarmed and leapt from his perch to flee. Dalinar charged Full Knight over that lip a moment later, jumping the horse, chasing the fleeing archer, who turned out to be a man in his 20s wearing rugged clothing. Dalinar had the option to run him down, but instead galloped Full Knight right past and kicked the archer in the back, sending him sprawling. Dalinar pulled up his horse, then turned it around to pass by the groaning archer who lay amid a heap of spilled black arrows. Dalinar's men caught up as he climbed roughly from the saddle, an arrow sprouting from each shoulder. He seized the archer, who had finally struggled to his feet and was scrambling, dazed, for his belt knife. Dalinar turned the fellow about, noting the blue tattoo on his cheek. The archer gasped, staring at Dalinar, covered in soot from the fires, his face a mask of blood from the broken nose and the cut scalp, stuck with not one, but 2 arrows. You waited until my helm was off, Dalinar demanded. You were an assassin. You were sent here specifically to watch for me. The man winced as Dalinar gripped him hard, and then nodded. Amazing, Dalinar said, letting go of the fellow. Show me that shot again. How far is that, Thaka? I'm right, aren't I? Over 300 yards? Almost 4, Thaka said, but with a height advantage. Still, Dalinar said, stepping up to the lip of the ridge. He looked back at the befuddled archer. Well, go grab your bow. My bow? The archer said. Yeah, are you deaf, man? Dalinar snapped. Go get it. The man regarded the 10 armed soldiers on horseback, grim-faced and dangerous, before wisely deciding to obey. He picked up his bow and a few arrows, then stepped hesitantly over to Dalinar, giving one glance to the similar shafts that were stuck into him. Went right through my storming armor, Dalinar muttered, shading his eyes. To his right, the armies clashed, and his main body of elites had caught up to press the flank. The rear guard had found some civilians and was shoving them out into the street. Pick a body, Dalinar said, pointing toward an empty square where a skirmish had happened. Stick an arrow in one if you can. The archer licked his lips, still seeming confused. Finally, he took a spyglass off his belt and studied the area. That one in blue, he said, near the overturned cart. Dalinar squinted, then nodded. Nearby, Thaka had climbed off his horse and slid out his sword, resting it on his shoulder. A not-so-subtle warning. The archer contemplated this, then drew his bow and launched a single, black-fletched arrow. It soared true, sticking into the chosen corpse. Stormfather, Dalinar said, lowering his hand. Thaka, before today I'd have bet you half the princedom that such a shot wasn't possible. He turned to the archer. What's your name, assassin? The man raised his chin, but didn't reply. Well, either way, welcome to my elites. Dalinar said, brushing off his hands. Someone get this fellow a horse. What? The archer said. I tried to kill you. Yes, from a distance, Dalinar said, letting one of his men help him onto his horse. which shows remarkably good judgment. I have use for someone of your skills. We're enemies. Dalinar nodded toward the town below, where the beleaguered army was at long last surrendering. Not anymore! That's the end. There you are, Stormlight 3, at long last. It's a year away. But, you can follow the progress bars on my website. We are going to go to the signing portion now. If you have a late number, it's going to be a while. Last night we got done at midnight.